This is an honor, so thank you for joining me. This is really exciting. We have never met in person, although in doing research about you, I certainly found out a lot of very interesting information that I want to ask you about. Certainly a legend of the sport. I saw a video of you and former teammate, friend Brody Smith from like 12 years ago. I don't know, do you remember that video that he interviewed you and you started talking about everybody's like 6'4" that's playing nowadays or something like
Yeah, it was I'd been asked to keynote at a conference, like a coaching conference by Tina Booth, and he happened to be there. So yeah.
Uh,
And that's the only time I ever met him. Um Funny guy. We had a good time, good laugh about it. Actually David Barkin was also there, kind of competitor from back in the day who, kind of put Ultimate Piece together and has made tremendous contributions to the sport on a much larger scale. But he joked during his intro that we came from a time when all Ultimate players were 5'6" or shorter, um, which of course we weren't. But he and I are both somewhat height challenged. So yeah.
yeah, well, I think so I'm gonna bear with me because I would probably be a little embarrassed if somebody did this about me in any capacity, but I'm gonna read your Hall of Fame bio. So
Okay.
just to give people a little perspective around who you are, because I think there will be a contingent of people that watch this that are will be enamored because they're like, wow, like Kenny Dobyns, that guy was a legend, he was the best. And then there'll probably be people that have never heard your name at all, and that's also part of why I want to do this. So let me just read
Yeah.
this,
Just
and I want to get your thought.
don't forget the third contingent, right? Kenny Dobbins. I hate that guy. All right. So don't forget those people. We've got to speak to the broad spectrum of your
All right. Well,
viewers.
they won't be listening. They're not going to listen. So, all right. Kenny Dobbins has been called the most intense competitor to ever play the game, a force of nature, and a living legend. During a 20-year career that spanned the 80s and 90s, Dobbins displayed an indomitable will to win, as well as a penchant for making spectacular plays seem routine. As the soul of the New York Dynasty, he helped lead the team to six national and four world championships, displaying a singular ability to step up when the game was on the line. But he was more than a physical marvel. Dobbins had brains as well as brawn. He was an innovator in ultimate strategy and tactics, incorporating a system of structured and set play offenses, complicated switching defenses, like we mentioned earlier, and a serious training regimen which made New York nearly unbeatable during their reign atop the sport. He was a dedicated leader, inspiring teammates and opponents alike with passionate intensity and willingness to sacrifice his body in order to make a play. While the ferocity of Dobbins' competitive spirit has prompted some to question his commitment to the spirit of the game, he earned the respect of those who played against him at the highest levels of competition by playing hard, fair, and with tremendous heart. As one longtime rival put it, Kenny never gave up. Not on a play, not in a game. Dobbins now lives in Pauley, New York, still finds the time to play Summer League, and is currently working to grow youth involvement in Ultimate through a new organization, Disc New York. Um, his notable accomplishments include the greatest and the stupidest, that will be a question later, voted most likely to be arrested his senior year of high school, can open a beer bottle with his teeth, and once stole a complete fire hydrant off a New York City street and carried it home. So for those listening, I wanted you to hear that because Kenny is a living legend of the sport. He's one of the best to ever play, and some consider so Kenny, in doing this interview, I talked to my old coach, who you may know, Kurt Dollenberg, and he said that you were, I mean, you and Mooney were like the two top, and he said most people may have said Mooney, but he considered you as the best at that time period to play. And he led the Miami Refugees, and they modeled their play after you. Like they deeply respected you and whatnot. So, what's your reaction to all of that Hall of Fame intro?
I mean, it's anytime I think you try to encapsulate, any person's, 20 years of play into kind of little paragraphs, you're going to leave some things out. You're going to focus on some things. And, I certainly don't run away from any of it. It was a great time and all those things are true. But at the same time, I think one of the things I loved about Ultimate from the very beginning that has since changed was this idea that you couldn't score unless two people were involved, that no one person could ever just run the table and score, which you can do in pretty much every sport. Somebody can just score. And until the Callahan rules, you couldn't do it in Ultimate. It always had to be one player passing to another player. And I love that idea that it truly is a team sport. And so when you're focusing on individuals, as a Hall of Fame does by definition, and individual accomplishment, it sometimes kind of overshadows the fact that at the end, nobody gets to be where I got to be if you're not on a great team. And part of that, sort of our structured offense is that at the end of the day, a lot of plays were called for me. And so I got a lot of chances to be successful. And at the same time, there were tons of great players on our team who were role players who weren't necessarily getting called forth in the play. And maybe on another team, they ended up with casting a bigger shadow, but they chose to be on our team and play a role. And if all those great players hadn't made that choice, we wouldn't have had the kind of record of success that we had. So it it by definition focuses on me, but none of that stuff happens without all those other people.
So, uh, before we get into maybe like your history, so I mentioned in preparing for this, I talked to my old coach, Curto,
Yeah.
and one of the things he talked about has actually nothing to do with your play, but as I was going through like the Hall of Fame, who's in the Hall of Fame, uh, he goes, the one person that's missing from this list is Kenny Dobyns' mom. He said that she should be in the Hall of Fame. And the reason why he said he's like because she was like the first to show up at tournaments consistently, and she had like the orange slices, the bananas, the Gatorades. She'd bring beer at for the end of the day, only after the end of the day. But like, and even I read another story about how even Steve Mooney like would come up and give her a hug. Like she was obviously focused on you guys, your team, but kind of was like a welcoming force for everybody and was one of the really the first to do it and follow you guys around at tournaments. And so Kurt was like, she should be in the Hall of Fame because she was amazing. Like she was the innovator of the sport in that. Can you tell us about that?
Well, I don't disagree with Kurt. I'll tell you that. I think it would be great. I mean, as a contributor, I don't know that it's ever going to happen, but it's funny because it's truly an X factor to have that level. Because right back then, as you probably know now from talking to various people, we didn't have a keen understanding of good training regimens, of good nutrition. People would show up to tournaments, with a bagel in their bag and a banana, and that was about it. And so she recognized the need, and then she filled the need, and filled it spectacularly. But early on, we were at a tournament. I don't even remember which one, but some of other competitors, some other players came and started taking stuff from the table, and we got all bent out of shape about it. And she basically stopped us in our tracks and said, "Listen, there's only one way this works. All players are welcome, and you guys keep your mouths shut or I'm gone." Because she was much more committed to the sport than this. I mean, we were her vehicle to get in, but she was totally committed to the sport and all the players. So that was a rule. Like we couldn't, even as I mean, believe me, I looked over there and I'd see Mooney. I wasn't happy about it, but my mom was, and to his credit, he was always super gracious and super kind to her. Frankly, as the entire Ultimate community was. She passed recently, and I was going through her stuff,
Sorry
and
to hear.
well, she had a great run, and I was fortunate to have her as my mom. But um, the Santa Barbara women sent a card to her after a tournament, just thanking her, and it
Mm-hmm.
was so cool because I had no idea. She never said anything about it.
Mm-hmm.
And for years after she stopped going to tournaments and I stopped playing, she was still like she's a lifetime member of the UPA. She would get the newsletter. Like she's, that her commitment to the sport went beyond her commitment to New York. Um, but Kurt's not wrong. And openly, I'll tell I did wanted to mention this because I was thinking about Kurt because you mentioned him, with the for the Mooney interview. Um, that team was tough. Like they had grit that we really admired. And our first year that we won nationals, it was down in Miami, 87. And our first game was against the refugees. and we beat them by 1 point. We squeaked out the victory by 1 point. The rest of that tournament, we ran the table. I think our smallest margin of victory was 7 points, even through the semis and the finals. The one team that almost derailed New York at its inception was the Refugees. We squeaked out a game point win against them, which is pretty cool.
Wow. Wow. Oh, he'll be listening. He'll probably love to hear that because
Yeah.
he said they emulated their game off of New York Y'all's game. They respected the hell out of you guys. Like
Oh, it
it
was
was
mutual. I can tell you
yeah.
this: anytime you played them, we knew we were in for a fight, and I mean in a
Yeah.
good way. Like it was going to be grit. They're determined. They don't back down. They never did back down. And certainly through our run, there were times, and you probably have experienced this because you've been on successful teams. There are times when you know you've got a team beat early in the game because they don't believe they can beat you. And that was one thing we never had with the Refugees. It didn't matter to me. They didn't care who they were playing. They were going to bring their game. And that's a mark of a team that's confident in their ability and in their approach, is that they're not really scared of anybody.
Curto told me about a time when he mentioned that first Nationals was down in Miami, and he said that he remembers like at one point they had run out of water, and your mom was like, how can you guys run out of water? How you guys need water? Like this is great, And like you said, she's like at the forefront before there was nutrition and like,
Right,
oh, you should probably hydrate appropriately,
right,
And he was like, oh shoot, I gotta go get water. Like, oh,
right.
go.
Yeah, at their home tournament, right?
Right,
Where they're all
exactly.
they all live 15 minutes away, but they didn't bring enough water.
Yeah. Now, of course, the sidelines are packed with all sorts of gooeys and gummies and nutrition bars and all that stuff. Well, that's great. Well, I don't know if she'll get into the Hall of Fame, but nonetheless, it's pretty cool to have her kind of recognized as one of the forefront. So, how
Yeah.
did you mentioned a little bit how you fell in love with Ultimate, like what you loved about it. How did you find Ultimate Frisbee? Like, what brought you in, and what kind of got you to uh, play at like such a competitive level?
Well, so I was a younger brother. My brother Brian, also in the Hall of Fame, and actually I think we're the only two brothers, I believe, still. But he was 3 years older, and so we lived in New York City, and he went to Hampshire College. And so he started playing Ultimate at Hampshire, and kind of brought it home with him during breaks. And around the same time, I spent one really ill-advised year at Northfield Mount Hermon boarding school in Massachusetts, not that far from Amherst, where Hampshire is. And I left campus, which you're not allowed to do, and hitchhiked down to Amherst for the Easterns tournament. And they played a game under the lights at Amherst. And when I saw that, I was kind of just blown away. I mean, I think that's probably the moment I knew this was what I really wanted to do. But prior to that, we would play in Central Park like 3-on-3 games. I mean, my introduction to Ultimate was 3-on-3 Ultimate, um, just on a patch of dirt, and because he was my brother, I wanted to be better than him at everything. And so even as I was playing with him and he was teaching me the game, in the back of my mind, I was saying, I'm gonna be better than you. Just because that's what younger brothers do. And so I think that's part of it, is just there was always this sense that I needed to be better, but also, the kind of drive just to be great. Once I realized it was what I wanted to do, and I still do this to this day, like pretty much everything I do, I try to do the best I can in that moment. And I mean everything. Cooking a meal, driving somewhere, like okay, it's going to take this much time. I want to get there in less time than that. It's just there's this inner drive, and I don't know where that came from, but this desire to always do everything you do to the best of your ability. Some of it's from my maternal grandfather. He was a welder. He used to also come to a lot of tournaments. He came to a few nationals, but once I used to spend summers with him, and one summer he taught me to weld, and we were doing wood stoves, and he would only let me work on the interior welds because I didn't know what I was doing, and they were sloppy and they'd pop. And so I got a little bit better, and he looked at one of my interior welds and he asked me what I thought, and I was like, "Pop, it looks pretty good." And he said, "No, it doesn't." And he took a chisel and chipped it out. And I was like, "But it's on the inside. Nobody's ever going to see it." And he said, "You'll know." So that idea that you can't ever do less than your best, I got ingrained in me at a really early age and brought that with me to the sport.
Mhm.
So I would say it's a combination of those factors, a desire to be better than my brother, a desire to be great at everything I do, and then just the fact that it was such a cool sport.
Hmm. Wow. as you're talking, I'm hearing I feel like I'm similar in some ways. Just like if I do it, I need to be the best. Like that's just my goal, my desire. And I have three younger brothers who, I was always the same mentality. Like I can't let them be better than me at anything. They are better than me at some things. I remember when they first started beating me in video games, and I was so upset, so upset. But yeah. Anyway, so that's great. Okay, so then you you saw it under the lights, you kind of immediately fell in love. Did you play any other sports? Or like were you like obviously you wouldn't be considered one of the best if you weren't already athletic. You didn't have, athletic ability. Did you play other sports? What do you think contributed to your skill? Or were you kind of a total kind of noob with throwing the frisbee right away? Or did you kind of easily transition or was it a longer transition?
I'd say it's a longer transition. I mean, I think obviously that, catching is fairly easy. Running patterns comes from other sports. I played football. I wasn't big. I mean, I still not big, but I wrestled freshman in high school and I was 98 pounds, basically built exactly like I am, just 98 pounds. But when I played football, my mom came and I mean, the kids even back then are huge as ninth graders. I mean, there are some really big kids. So she didn't want me to keep playing football. She liked the idea of wrestling because I got matched up against somebody my own size. I played baseball, I played soccer. So yeah, I was an athlete. I mean, I was, playing all the time. But, when some of the first tournaments we went to, and this goes back to, the late 70s, if you got 7 or 8 people together, you would go to the tournament. And my brother was an organizer. So he was always involved and always knew people. And we happened to play at a tournament again up in Amherst with Jim Herrick, Hall of Famer, and really a guy who, in the kind of generation before me, was one of the greats. And and after the game, he came up to me and he said, learn to throw, and you're going to be something in this game. Because at that time, I couldn't throw, but I could run a pattern and I could catch anything that was close to me. And so it was, that's throwing comes, at least in that day and age, throwing came last because we weren't coached, right? We didn't come out of coaching programs. We were just, you'd pile into a car and go to a tournament and you'd learn on the fly
You just
and
figure it out.
you
Yeah.
just figure it out. And I think, that's one thing I think that's hugely different in the sport now is that back then, even through New York's run, it was very rare to be playing against players who had been coached or had been through a coaching program. And now there's probably nobody playing who hasn't been coached or been through a coaching program. And it does, I mean, the skill level is much higher. Everybody has every throw, but at the same time, they're sort of being taught this is the way you play. And none of us had any kind of teaching like that. Like it was
Mm,
do whatever makes sense and we'll see if it works. So it was a much
mm.
more open game in terms of the level of creativity you could bring to a strategy, an approach, a throw, um, but not as skilled a game because there wasn't that level of kind of working on the skills and understanding what the most likely to be successful throws are. And let's try those before we start trying the 40-yard crossfield hammer into the wind.
Was there a moment that you knew that you could be one of the best or the best when you were playing?
I'm not sure if there was a moment, but I, I had a, I was not very tolerant of people who weren't as good as I was early on because I didn't understand that the things that I saw and could do were not things that everybody could see and could do, right? And because it just seemed like I could do it so easily, why couldn't they? And so I had a not very good reputation among my teammates of being not supportive, of yelling at them when they made a mistake, things like that, to the point where the best team in New York, and this was probably 1982, the New York Heifers, actually voted me off the team for the fall season because I was just a hothead. I was impossible to play with. Um, but there was probably a game went up to Cornell and played, and somebody just threw a pass. It was a crossfield pass. It wasn't much, but it was really a bad throw. And I just kind of, without even thinking about it, just launched into the air and ended up, way off the ground, kind of made a stabbing motion with my hand and caught it. And there was sort of this moment where I was suspended in the air, kind of all my limbs going in a different direction, holding the disc. And you could sort of hear this gasp from everybody, like, what just happened? And
How
I
did he
think
do
that,
that?
yeah, right. That was a moment where I was like, oh, okay, so not everybody can do this, and I would say that was sort of that first aha moment of, you can do things, you're gifted in a way that maybe not everybody is, and some of it's physical, some of it's mental, some of it's the willingness to do it without thinking about it. Um, and then I would say that, as far as the true greatness, it really was about the team. I mean, we played on Kaboom, and Kaboom was great, and we had some great runs, but we couldn't quite break through. But once you get that supporting cast around you, that's when you sort of realize, wow, we as a team could be something special. And that was 87.
So how did that come about? Like, so New York, New York. So you've won seven national championships. You have won five world championships, if I have that
Personally.
right.
Yeah, personally, but two of them were in mixed. So the one national championship and one world championship was in mixed. So with New York, it was 6 and 4 that I won. Six national, four
Okay.
world.
Okay, 6 and 4 that you won. How did But you started playing in the late 70s, right? And you won your first national championship, and I think it was 85,
87.
87, excuse
Yeah,
me,
87.
which was the beginning of kind of a long run, right? How did you, because obviously you mentioned at the beginning, it's a team sport. You can't score until the invention of the Callahan, which I had to think about for a second of like, what's the example? Oh, yeah, Callahan, of course. Somebody on the other team threw it. But how did you build a team? Because, for anybody that's won a championship, you cannot do it alone. You need a good crew of surrounding athletes, players that are all bought in. How did you build that kind of that team?
Well, certainly the first thing was Pat King, you know, graduated from Dartmouth and came back to New York. And really Pat King and I got together to form Kaboom. And Pat King, and I'll say this till I can no longer speak. Pat King's the greatest player I've ever seen. And so the two of us together were kind of a force in and of itself. Like to have two really great players, but also really smart players who kind of were thinking about the game and super competitive people. Quick little story about Pat King. We used to go to the Dublin House Bar at Broadway and 79th Street. He lived real close by. And if you go from Amsterdam to Columbus in New York City, it's right behind the Museum of Natural History. It's straight up a hill and then straight down. And he challenged me to sprint one night leaving the Dublin House Bar at probably 1 o'clock in the morning. And and he's a great runner. Like he never imagined I was going to beat him because he didn't think I could keep going on the uphill, and I beat him. And to tell you how competitive Pat is, he still talks about it. I saw him about a month ago in the city, and he asked me if I'd race him again. Like, and there's no way. I mean, I beat him once. I would never try to beat him
Right.
again. But that's how, like, that's the level of his competitiveness is that, what is it now? God, 50 years later, he's still thinking about it. 45 years later that I beat him that one time. So, um, so the two of us came together with Kaboom, and that was 83. And that was the first year that we qualified from New York. New York sent a team to nationals. And there were two things that happened there. One is they changed the nationals format. So two teams went from each region rather than one. And it happened first in, I guess, 82, the year the Rude Boys won. But it just opened the door to more teams. And so New York first sent a team, New York City team with Kaboom in 1983. And that was our first taste of kind of high level play. That same year, we went out to Santa Cruz in 83. There was a World Flying Disc Championships and 84. So we were just kind of broadening our horizons, playing teams around the country and getting better. But we didn't break through. I mean, we were in the game to go to semis in 83, the game to go to semis in 84. We made the finals in 85, semis in 86, but each time we came up short. And Pat and I would have these conversations. We just didn't have enough talent. We had gathered other people who we knew, other players who'd graduated college, but we just weren't strong enough. And then in 86, a bunch of other players graduated college. It's kind of a younger set and formed Spot. And actually, my brother formed the team in New York. And so it was Kaboom and Spot were the two New York City teams. And in the
You and your
86,
brother competed against each other? Like
oh,
he created a
oh yeah,
separate team?
yeah,
Interesting.
yeah. And actually, we competed against each other one time, and I covered him. I only covered him once, and I was all over him. I mean, I was just really physical. And at one point, he caught a pass, and I was like backpacking him, and he got up and he hit me with the disc like as hard as he could. I never covered him again. It was too personal. Um, but yeah, we competed against
Did you
each
guys
other.
have like a rivalry? Was it a rivalry type of relationship or
You know, I it's it's hard to say. My brother's a completely was a completely different person in terms of his mindset. Loved the sport, loved sharing the sport with others, was a great coach, but he didn't have that personal drive to be great, which I did. And so from that perspective, like I always had goals that were greater than where I was. I was always reaching for something, whereas his goals were more about kind of spreading the sport, bringing more people in, a much more altruistic approach, openly, a better man than me, for sure. But yeah, from a competitive level, I was much more competitive and much more driven than he was. Um, but we did compete, and so and that year in '86 was kind of the seminal experiences. We lost to Boston, whatever team they were back then, in the finals in a brutal game, like 22-21, like 3.5 hour game. And so then we had to play the losers bracket final, and the spot team had sat there watching us just beat ourselves to death against Boston. And there's every reason in the world to believe that they would knock us off and they would also go to nationals and we wouldn't. And in that game to go, we destroyed them. And that was the moment when they realized that Kaboom knew how to win, but Kaboom could never win nationals without the talent that Spot had. And Spot had talent, but they didn't have grit, determination. And so it was really the combination of bringing in their talent with our will to win, our grit, our determination, and leadership. And that was the merger that formed New York. Was after '86 nationals, Pat orchestrated a meeting with the leaders of Spot, and we put the two teams together. And
Mm.
and that is what became New York. So it really was about the combination of leadership, will, grit, the mental game, and the additional talent that we were able to bring in from Spot.
Interesting. And you don't hear about that too often, certainly in today's game, because you need Boston's probably the main team that there's like two or more good teams that end up combining. But why did they initially start a different team? What was the reasoning behind that? Because, like I said, at least in my experience, if you're in San Francisco, the best team is Revolver, and you try to get on that team. You don't say, you know what, we're all gonna just start a new team, because we don't like that team or whatever, right? But what kind of drove that? What was the reason? Did they not want to play with you guys? Did they just was
You
it
know,
a
I'm
diff? Were they just all college buddies? I
I'm
mean,
speculating because I don't know. But certainly my brother didn't want to play with Kaboom, so he started the team. So that
so
so
your
that was
brother is
something.
he's responsible.
But yeah, they were guys just out of college, and I think from their perspective, like they wanted to be big on their team. Like they wanted to have a team that, rather than subsume themselves to what Kaboom was, they wanted to be something different. Um, there was another guy at that time, Dan Weiss, who came from California, and he was kind of a cagey veteran, knew the game and had great throws, and so he was an asset. And he didn't particularly want to play with Kaboom because we had a reputation for being a little off color, a little too aggressive,
To
and
New
and
York.
there you go, and that was not consistent with his approach. And a couple of other people, Walter Vanderschaff, who's now in the Hall of Fame, came out of UVM. Dave Blau and John Gewirtz came out of Cornell. So it was a lot of young guys right out of college who I think probably to some degree wanted to make a name for themselves that was separate from what Kaboom was. Um,
Yeah.
and then there might have been more of that, I think, probably in that age as well, just because Boston had the same thing with Earth Atomizer and kind of as the second team, and they eventually merged. But Earth was a team in and of itself for a while. So, that kind of desire to be other than the main team, to sort of make a name for yourself to some degree. I don't know.
Was Kaboom's reputation for being too strong of a desire to win, too aggressive, too hot-headed, or whatever? Was it primarily because of you, or was it the whole team? Certainly, you're one of the best players, the best player. You have influence on the culture. I mean, I was born in New York City. I grew up probably not too far from where you live now, but I grew up in Connecticut, so I'm familiar. My dad was a New Yorker, my grandfather was a New Yorker, so I know what that's like. I probably have a little bit of that in me for sure. But was it kind of everybody? Was it kind of few people like pushing that down? What made you guys different in that sense? Was it just because y'all were New Yorkers, or?
Yeah, I mean, it's, it's like asking, it's like trying to think back, how did this particular personality trait come up? It sort of was there. I mean, it just fit. We were New Yorkers. We were, and we're talking about the, New York of the early 80s, which was a very different New York than it is now. I mean, it was a time of, significant kind of crime and kind of social disruption. And you sort of had to have this kind of armor in order to really survive, and particularly young and not having a lot of money. Like, we lived in a lot of sketchy neighborhoods. I mean, the neighborhood where I lived, was, they were selling crack openly on the street because that's what I could afford to live in. And some of the guys living out in Brooklyn were, in what's now, Dumbo, which is like, none of us could have afforded what Dumbo is today. But back then it was, they were just converting lofts and old warehouses, and, it was a really gritty, sketchy neighborhood. So yeah, I think there was some of it was environmental, and some of it was leadership driven. And I think it'd be hard to parse it out to tell you
Yeah.
exactly where it originated. But it was an environment pretty much everybody was comfortable with. Um, so we wore it. When we went to nationals in '83, we ran into a Dallas Sky Pilots team that, to me, was way, way worse than we ever were. And they beat us. And so there was that too, which was like, wow, like, in our little neck of the woods, we were looked on as too aggressive. But when you go to the national level, there's some teams that are playing some really, and in that day, Windy City, St. Louis, like, some of the more successful teams had a lot of grit about how they played. And so to us, it's just, that was sort of like, okay, there's nothing wrong with this. We just don't have enough talent. Um,
Right, we need better players.
yeah.
Yeah. So I was going through the Hall of Fame list, and correct me if I'm wrong, but there look to be 10 people from New York that are in the Hall of Fame, which is incredible. Just that people that played on one team that are in the Hall of Fame. You mentioned a few of these names. Obviously, you, Dan Weiss, Andy Bornstein, Jeff Blau, Pat King, who you mentioned, Dennis Warson, Bill Rodriguez, Dave Blau, Bob Deman, and Walter Vanderschaff all played on New York during that run. So you talked about getting talent. Which part of those came from Kaboom, and which part of those came from the other team that you mentioned? Were there players on both that kind of came together out of that?
Yeah. So,
Those
so,
10?
so first of all, for clarity, Andy Bornstein is in as a contributor, and he actually never played on New York, New York. He was part of Kaboom. Um,
Oh, okay, okay.
so when we
I
went
blame
from,
Kurto for that because he mentioned his
okay,
name.
yeah, and look, instrumental, because, a lot of the offensive, structure that we brought to New York, we had at Kaboom. We just didn't have as many talented players. So you have the first three guys in the play, and the fourth guy was not, of the level of the first three, kind of thing. So, but Andy brought a lot of that structure and sophistication and strategy. A really strategic thinker and a really smart guy who I really enjoyed playing with. But he didn't make the cut athletically more than anything. And then Bob Demand came later. He was out of ECU. But, in terms of the original group that came, so Walter Vanderschaff came from Spot. Dan Weiss came from Spot. Dave Blau came from Spot. Pat King and I came from Kaboom. Dennis Warson was an add-on, so he wasn't on Spot or Kaboom. Billy Rodriguez came later. So really, is, I guess, from the original Kaboom team, it was just Pat and me, and really, not surprisingly, more from Spot, because in the end, I think they were a more talented team. They were deeper than Kaboom was. They just didn't have the same leadership or kind of grit. Um, and look, there are more people. I mean, when you play with guys and you see who they are up close, you recognize things that are harder to see at a distance. But certainly, I believe there are people on New York who aren't in the Hall of Fame who certainly could be, some who maybe should be. But also, there's a point where it's, you can't have that many people from a single team, right? Not if you're going to truly represent the sport as a whole, and early on, because the Hall of Fame members vote themselves, you know, I wasn't thinking as a voter broadly enough, but eventually I began to understand that, yeah, you do need to recognize teams that maybe never won a championship, but still had great players on that team and deserved recognition for their longevity. Because it can't just be, oh, these are all the best players from all the best teams, because that's not a true representation of the sport.
That's what it
Took me a
seems
while to.
like just from I don't know a lot of the names, from the early part of the list or played against them, but it seems like in some of the research I did, it seems like they were the best player on the best team type thing. But if there are good players that you talk about longevity, there's a number of factors. It doesn't appear that people have been able to get in through that, at least
No,
from what I've
and
seen.
look, it's openly any process has flaws, right?
Right.
And I do think the Hall of Fame voting process, though it's improved over the years, it's beset by flaws. And look, maybe there's just, there's also kind of, do we really need a Hall of Fame? I don't know. I didn't start playing thinking someday I'm going to be in the Hall of Fame. It didn't exist when I started playing. So it's
Right.
a little bit different, but there's also kind of an interesting thing. And I was actually just thinking about this recently, thinking about the fact that we were going to have a chance to talk, but there was a period of 11 years where nobody won a national championship who wasn't from New York or Boston. And that's amazing, and so yeah, if it can only be the people who win, well then for that stretch of time, a lot of people have no chance because they couldn't beat one of those two teams, and those teams didn't lose for 11 years straight. Um, that I don't know that you'll ever see a period like that in the sport again, right? That level of domination from one little small geographic area, right? Boston and New York. I
Yeah.
mean, 3 hours apart, kind of
Yeah.
thing. So,
The closest thing that's come to it would be, Revolver in the 2010s. I think they won like five, maybe six in the
well,
2010s, but it
but
was
was it
not
whether
back to back
right?
like you guys all did. And it was just one city. It was not kind of like Revolver in Portland or Seattle. They were good, but not winning championships.
And as Steve pointed out, and we knew it at the time, like we made Boston what they were by beating them for all those years. And so once they learned those very difficult lessons, then they carried that into their reign.
Tell us about the run, the first championship when you won. How did you feel? And then I said this to Mooney too, but the hardest thing to do in sports is to repeat, while hitting a baseball. But one of the hardest things would be to do it again. But you guys did it, what, five times in a row? Like, how was, like, you guys had great players, but you had the will to win. Speak a little bit about that, like that first championship. And then how did you guys get propelled to win so many in a row?
Well, I could certainly tell you that the first championship, after all those years of wanting it, there was unquestionably a moment of, that's it. Like it was almost not enough. So in '87 we won it. I mean, it's great. I mean, you're the champ. You've done it. But then you sort of look around. It's like, okay, that's like now what? and and I think that's part of the challenge is that you attain that goal, and then and we're talking about, again, a volunteer sport. We've all got jobs. We've got families. We're doing other things. Like it's hard to repeat as a professional athlete with all those people driving you and all the potential contract money. But like in a sport that's completely amateur, like where's the drive? Why go through all of that again? Um, and openly, we did not. I don't think we prepared as hard for '88 as we had for '87, and we lost to Tsunami in a game. We were up 18-15, and they scored the last six goals. And so we lost in the semis in '88. And that was a truly gutting experience. Like, that's when you learned, okay, that's why you try as hard, is because you never want to feel like this again. And so that loss drove the next five wins more than anything, was because we had it and we just let it slip through our fingers. And so from that point on, we sort of had this mantra of, it's not enough. It's never enough. If you're up by three, you got to be up by six. If you're up by six, you got to be up by nine. So it wasn't just that we won five in a row. Like we tried to crush everybody every time. Like we could never win by enough. And we put up some really big numbers on teams that did not expect that. I remember one year, probably '92, the top team in the Northwest was Rhino Slam. And everybody was like, you got to watch these guys. They're the best team in the West. They're coming after you. We destroyed them in the semis, mostly because so many people had said, these are the guys you got to watch out for. We just wanted them to know they didn't actually belong in the conversation with us. And so
Yeah.
we kind of walked around after that '88 loss with a perpetual chip on our shoulders. It was just, nobody could ever beat us if we played our best. And so we wanted to play our best always. And that meant, like, in the opening round of game of sectionals, like if we could shut out a team, we wanted to shut them out. Like we never took that sort of let's go easy on a team. It was always about let's crush everybody. So I think a lot of the run was born of the loss in the end. That
Yeah.
loss in '88 was particularly tough, and I think that's probably true for in a lot of either individual athletes or teams that they're more defined by their losses than the wins, because that's ultimately where all the motivation comes from. Everybody wants to win. You've got to hate to lose, and that's, I think, ultimately a more powerful motivator. And because we had that loss in '88, we all had that experience to look back on and say we never want to have that happen again. But I mean, we won in '87. We beat the defending champion, Windy City. When we won in '89, we got revenge on Tsunami, so we beat the defending champion again. And that's one thing I think there's a conundrum in sport, right? How do you win unless you believe you can win? And how do you believe you can win when you've never won? And so that's one of those things that, I think about a lot, even with my kids in baseball. How do you convince them that they're good enough to win when they've never done anything at the end of the season but lost? And so we had that, we had won and then we had lost. So we had the two sort of experiences to compare, and we knew what we needed to do to win, and we knew what we didn't want to do, what it would feel like to lose. And so that combination was the driver. We never really looked at it, at least I didn't, like, oh, we need to get two, and then we need to get three, and then we need to get four. It was, we need to crush everybody, always. And when we're done, we'll know. Like, when we're done, we'll recognize it and we'll be done. It was never like, let's win five or let's win six. It was, let's crush this team now because we're better than them and we need them.
Sometimes that's easier to digest and execute because you're just focused on the present right in front of you instead of, oh, we have this, let's go win five in a row. Let's win this whole tournament in day one. It's like, no, break it down into smaller pieces. And okay, we've got Tsunami, we've got Windy
Right.
City, we got Rhino Slam, whatever. Like, we're just going to crush them and then we'll worry about what's next afterwards, right?
It's,
But we only have one
yeah.
mission in mind, and that's this game right here.
And honestly, Kurt, I think you break it down even smaller than that. It's literally every point. Like
Yes.
every you need to crush this point, and we need to be
Hmm.
perfect this point. And if perfection and your best is your goal, you never get there. So you can always keep fighting for it, right? You can always still strive. Like for us, let's play the perfect game of Ultimate. We never did. We got close, but that was it. And so it was really like, and then even within the point, like each individual is I'm going to win against my guy this cut. And so the biggest challenge is how do you maintain that level of commitment and sort of engagement over a long period of time. It's not easy to do. And a lot of it has to come from this collective commitment to do it, because you keep driving each other, and one guy's a little bit off one day, but somebody else picks him up. But we all had this kind of high level of commitment to excellence that didn't allow us to relax. Now, it's exhausting. I mean, that's solid. It's truly exhausting. And the downside of it, I would say, is in the end, the outcome, when you win, it's like, okay, well, we expected that. So you don't end up with as much joy, like, oh, we won, what excitement. It's more like, okay, we did what we were supposed to do, you know, have a nice month or two off, and we'll come back and do it again next year.
Yeah, I totally understand. So one of the things that in my research, I learned was that, and even Curto mentioned this, was you guys were one of the first, if not the first, to train like Marines. You guys were just, first of all, you talked about playing to 21, which I don't even know what that means. Okay. So, my endurance training, well, I thought it was really good, back in the day. I don't know, maybe you guys did something different, but just the thought of playing to 21, I'm like, that seems crazy over the course of a tournament. So, probably a separate question, but what did New York do, because they seem to have a reputation of just being like Marines, like just animals out there, like could just like you talked about beating teams down. Well, you could have all the talent in the world, but if you can't run past, can't run a mile, or you don't have endurance late into the game,
Right.
you could be faster, you could jump higher, you could be stronger, but if you're fatigued, you're you're nothing, right? So what did you guys do? What was the training regimen? How did you guys get a buy-in for the whole team to do this?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I, because I know so much more about training than we knew then. Like, we weren't particularly smart about what we did. We just we were just brutal to ourselves, and so the we didn't run a lot of drills. We weren't savvy in that way. So our practices were basically very short scrimmages interspersed with sprints, just a ton of sprints. And the way we did the sprints is we broke up into three groups, so that basically as one team, you'd sprint, and basically as you reach the next team, the next group would go. And whether they were, long suicides, full length of the field, or cross field sprints, we were alternating short sprints with longer runs, but all of it with this idea that you didn't want to be beaten. And so in each one of those groups, there was intense competition not to lose, not to be the last one across the line, but also to be the first one. So there was, even within the training, it was more competitive than sort of collective. And we're just a lot of really competitive people. I mean, it's like there's so many things you do over the course of a career, but I remember one practice in particular. We had really long practices, 3.5, 4.5 hours, just really tough practices if we weren't at tournaments. But I had been out to a wedding the night before and was just hungover and feeling really horrible. And in the first scrimmage of the day, Will Longtain caught the winning goal, and we would scrimmage to three. There was very little playing and an intense amount of running, but he caught the goal and spiked it on me. And I was so furious that I said, I'm going to win every one of these 8 sprints. And I did. As hungover as I was, like, that was the kind of thing that you would dig down and find, is the will to win every one of 8 full field sprints. So there was a lot of that kind of competition as part of our training. And then Kevin Candy moved up to New York from DC. He was a force on the DC teams for many years, and he first played with us in 90. And he brought interval training because he was a triathlete. And the practices, once Kevin came, and the amount of interval training we did, were really on a whole nother level. And so where was the buy-in? I mean, the buy-in is we were successful. I don't know that we could have done it if we were losing, you know? That's I think that's probably true, is that at some point somebody would have said, I'm not going to do that. It doesn't translate, right? But because it was translating to wins, I think that was part of it. And then it's also the way we approached the games. Our offense would score very quickly in general, and our defense would go out. And really, all our best, not all our best, most of our best athletes and best runners were on the D line. And the whole point there was not to necessarily get a turnover and score. It was to make the other team work really hard. Because if their offense was exhausted in the second half, there's no way they could beat us. And so it was about kind of a war of attrition on the defensive side. And on the offensive side, it was about a high level of execution that gets the defense back on the field really quickly. And so that's one thing you would see in our games if you look at them, even at a high level, is it might be 3-1. And then next thing you know, it's, 5-2. And the next thing you know, it's like 8-3. And you realize the game's over because that offense just can't keep up with the athletes we had on our defense. And as you know, in the sport of ultimate, the only way to go on a run is on defense. So as long as our O always put the D back on the field, we could never lose because they were so strong. So, but yeah, I think, we all were athletes. And it's kind of funny when I think about the ultimate of the late 70s, a lot of people weren't necessarily athletes. They loved playing ultimate, but they were kind of, this is a groovy sport. We weren't very groovy, we would just, there wasn't a lot of groovy.
That's funny. So, can you give like some of the guys that I mentioned, can you give like a quick 20, 30 seconds on some of those kind of key players on the team? Like, you mentioned Pat King, Dennis, Jeff Blau, Dan Weiss, like some of those guys. Can you kind of just give like just a quick kind of highlight about what they did, who they were?
Well, Pat King's the best player ever, completely uncoverable, never got tired, and just, kind of creative genius, and competitive to the point of, you know, maybe he's not quite right in the head. I'll say that because I love him, but I mean, like, I still think it's crazy that he still remembers that sprint. But I mean, he could not be covered. He simply could not be covered. Dennis, dear friend, explosive leaper, just kind of a tremendous physical specimen, but on his own, kind of too scattered mentally to really be productive. What he got from us was we were able to focus him and rein him in, that allowed his explosiveness and kind of youthful exuberance to thrive. Walter Vanderschaft, probably the most graceful human I've ever had the pleasure of playing with. You know how there are guys you play with who, like, a lot of people come up and say, hey, that was an amazing catch. And you're like, maybe it was, maybe it wasn't. It wasn't that tough. when Walter would come up to me and say, that was amazing, I knew I'd done something amazing because he was that guy. Like he could do amazing, truly amazing things. And still is doing them, which blows my mind. Dan Weiss, one of the most artful, gifted throwers I've ever played with. Um, Also a really competitive guy, though he likes to hide it under his kind of Mickey Mouse hats, but he's a real, a gritty competitor. Um, Bill Rodriguez, he's got 12 national championships. He doesn't have a forehand. Um, I mean, hard to believe, but, um, you can get by with, not having all the skills, but brilliant, brilliant guy and a great teammate and really another fierce competitor. And I would say if you go through all of them, the streak of fierce competitiveness, I think runs through all of them. The one guy I wasn't sure about when he first started playing with us is Bob Deman. Truly a great athlete. And I mean, could play any sport, could have been in any sport, but I always felt like there was something about him. He was too nice. He was one of those guys on our team who was nice. And Walter's also nice, but not as nice as Bob Deman. And I was always like, is this guy tough enough? And so I would cover him in practice, even though he's like, a foot taller than me at least. And I would just body the shit out of him. I would just pummel him just to see if he'd get mad. And he really didn't. But once you kind of peeled back that nicety, he was another guy. I mean, when we were playing, I mentioned that game against Rhino Slam in 92. Bob, at one point, after scoring another goal or throwing another goal, just turned to their whole sideline and just walked one to the other. You can't cover me. You can't cover me. You can't cover me. None of you can cover me. And that's, it was in there, but it was deep. It was deep in there with Bob. Otherwise, he was a really nice guy. I don't know if I left anybody out, but that's it.
No, that's great. That's great. So turning to the kind of the competition during your run and maybe even after, Boston was kind of budding at that time, right? But you guys had their number. What happened at the end of the run? And was it kind of Boston the whole time? And then they kind of finally overtook you? Were you guys kind of getting older? I know you picked up some young guys with spots. How did that happen?
Yeah, well, so I think, and Boston was more than up and coming. I mean, they were a great team during the run. And I think there was sort of a reputation for Boston around the country of, a great team, they just can't beat New York, but they could beat everybody else. And so, what was it about that relationship? One is obviously their close proximity. So we saw them all the time. And when you're being chased by somebody who's that good, you got to work really hard, and we knew that. We had one tournament against them where it was a Cuervo event, and it was in Boston, and we scored like the last 4 goals to beat them, and they had the disc to win 4 times and couldn't do it. And I remember looking at them and talking to the team and saying, look how crushed they are. They're going to come at us that much harder at nationals, so we've got to be that much better. And so they definitely drove us, because we didn't ever want to lose to them. But I also think there was something mentally that we were just tougher than they were. We were both a lot of good athletes, a lot of great skill, worked really hard. But when all of that is equal, it's whoever's stronger mentally who's generally going to win. And so that's one place where we sort of always had an edge on them, is we just knew we were tougher than they were. And I don't know how you get to that point. I just know, being in that point, that we didn't have any doubt about it, and I don't think they did either. But I mentioned before sort of that sometimes when you're as focused as we were, it's hard to get joy because you're working so hard. And basically at the end of any year, there were basically 2 options. It was good if we lost, it would be abject misery, and if we won, it's relief because we didn't lose. And so when as much as hating to lose is a stronger motivator, it's also not a positive motivator, right? And so it's hard to really get joy in those moments because really all you've done is avoid losing. And that just got tiresome, and I'll personally, we played the 93. We were definitely, like, you could see we were starting to get older and slower. And at that time, God, what was the team? How can I not remember their name? It was sort of East Bay and South Bay came together, double happiness. And we played against them at Worlds in Madison. And we had lost to Gainesville, vicious cycle combo team. We had to brawl through Boston and Rhino Slam in the quarters and semis to get to the final. And these guys were like that. They were faster, they could jump higher, they were younger, but they couldn't beat us. Like we still beat them. And it was, we sort of talked about it being smoke and mirrors. Like we were gritty enough and talented enough and smart enough, savvy enough to get by them. They were playing zone to man to take us out of our play. And so we would just basically play a little bit of zone offense until they transitioned into man, and then we'd run the play. And so it just we found a way to make it work. But then coming into nationals that year, that's who we ended up facing in nationals because we beat Boston in semis. And it's like, well, of course they're going to win because we beat them at Worlds and they're better than us and they're going to have worked harder. And I remember I went out to watch the women's final and there was double on a field 3 hours before the game scrimmaging. And I realized there's no way they could beat us. They were so scared of the moment. Like that's, you know, like, there's no reason to be out there 3 hours before the game scrimmaging
Right. That's
unless
nerves.
you're,
Yeah.
yeah, you're so wound up. You got to go do something. And I looked over and I was like, oh, they're done. and, and we won. But here's the worst part, Kurt, is that I think we had 20 plus turnovers in that game and we won by 8. And I remember thinking, this is a joke. Like we were terrible. How did we not lose?
It
And
was the fear factor. They were afraid of the moment. The New
yeah,
York, like, yeah,
you have to ask them. But there was, I mean, of all the years of winning, and maybe it wasn't truly fulfilling or joyful. Like that was one where I was almost embarrassed. How could we have won when we were that terrible? And personally, at that point, I was done. When you are in a leadership role on a team and you approach that the way I did, every practice is grueling because you're coming at full energy because you've got to motivate all the people around you. And I took that very seriously. Like I could never be less than my best. It was exhausting and I was done. And I just said, Kriver was probably my closest friend on the team at the time. And I was like, look, I'm not playing again next year. And actually in 94, they went to Worlds because we won it in 93. I didn't go. I was done. I was just done. I didn't want to play with that team in that game anymore. I wanted to be done with it. And so we disbanded. So the team that played in 94 was Cajones, but it's not just that it was a different name. Like half the team was gone, a bunch of young guys. It's just we weren't New York. So effectively what happened to allow Boston to get in is New York broke up. It wasn't the
uh,
same team. And I'm sure I bear some level of responsibility for it because I was the first one to say, look, I'm done and I'm not going to do it anymore. But I think in many ways we were done. There are guys who would say that's not true, who wanted to keep it going. But I don't think there was enough commitment anymore. So, and our whole cheer was, what is it not enough? What is it never enough? And so I guess at Worlds, I wasn't there, but when they won that game at Worlds in 94, they said, what is it? Enough. And everybody walked away.
did they win Worlds?
They did in a crazy
Okay.
comeback against Sweden. They won. Um,
Well,
but it was enough. I mean, we had I don't think we ever, like I said, we never set out and said, oh, we're going to win 5 in a row. We're going to win all the like we set out to be great, and we were great, and we were great for as long as we could be great, and then it was enough.
and how old were you at that time? Did you like completely step away from the game?
No, I continued to play, although basically, and I blame Dennis for this. I didn't want to. Like I wanted to do whatever was next in my life, and Dennis was just relentless. And so we formed this team, Cajones, and I played with these young guys. But I never practiced that way again. I never trained that way again. Like I just couldn't do it physically. Um, so what was that? That was 93. So I was 32.
Wow. Okay. So you're still relatively young,
By
in the
today's
sense,
standards, but
yeah, by today's standards. But
yeah,
yeah, if you
I-
were just training by sprinting at practice all the
exactly.
time, then yeah, I'm sure it takes a toll on your body.
Yeah. And that was the part, like if we'd understood that, and I'll tell you, a couple of people, Andy Sheeman, great player, role player, but really a solid role player, but very understanding of his body and physical fitness and would go to a gym near his house. And he trained properly with people who knew what they were doing. Walter Vanderschaft, the same. I mean, those guys were able to keep going because they took care of their bodies in ways that I never did and never really understood how. And so they were able to keep playing and keep playing at a high level. I beat my body up for a long time. And I knew doing it. Like, I mean, I remember I went to see an orthopedist because I had a post knee surgery. And he looked at the x ray of my knee and he's like, this is the knee of a 65-year-old man. And I mean, I was 30, 29. And he's like, you're going to have arthritis. You're going to have pain. And I was like, okay, you know. thanks. And I do. I mean, I do,
Right. Right.
but those are the deals you make, glory now
Yeah.
and pain later.
Do you like regret any of that not taking your body the proper way? I mean, you said you didn't know, right? So, but like also it was your personality to go 110% in everything you do because if it wasn't, it wouldn't be you.
Yeah. So I mean, I don't regret it. I mean, it's
Yeah.
because there's no other way to do it. And so it'd be foolish to say I do, right? Um, what I will say is, I mean, I've so many rotator cuff injuries, basically from laying out and you land on your elbow and it jerks your elbow up. And I've
Yeah.
so many rotator cuff injuries. And when I feel bad is when my son wants to play baseball and I'll go out there and I'll gut it out. I mean, I'll throw with him and I'll wince, and then I can't sleep that night because my shoulders hurt so much, and
Yep.
that
Yep.
is unfortunate. But I mean, at the end of the day, I'm 63, like, and I'm playing with a 9-year old. Like, what can I
Right.
expect, right? I don't know.
Right.
I probably would still be feeling this way even if I hadn't played all those years of Ultimate. I'm just an old man.
Right.
Um,
Right.
but no, I don't. I don't regret it. I had some crazy injuries over the years. The kidney was wild. Um, but
Kidney?
yeah, I split my kidney in half playing in a game.
You split it in half? It's inside your body. How do you do
Yes.
that?
Yeah, it's pretty wild. It's an injury that's most consistent with football players, actually, I think. But I was just going after a pass and an overhead that had come over my head this way. So I was tracking the disc and the receiver was coming this way towards me. And I went up and blocked it. But when I hit it, I exposed my back and he was running. And when he saw me coming towards him, he pulled up his knees. So basically, I took a knee at like full sprint in my back. And the diagnosis was renal fracture, which, I say that to people who are trained doctors, and they're like, you can't do that, but that was the diagnosis. And I mean, I was in the hospital for 2 weeks. So yeah, there are downsides to that level of kind of all out sacrifice your body play that most people didn't experience because they didn't quite do that. But like you said, I mean, I don't think I could have done it any other way. So
Yeah.
it doesn't make much sense now to say I regret it. Um,
So you basically retired, you were done. What was the rivalry like between you and Mooney? I assume he was a little younger. What was that rivalry like?
so I think he was probably older because our paths actually crossed. He graduated from Riverdale Country Day School in the Bronx, and I actually went there for 2 years. I got expelled. I was a bit of a problem child, but he's a little older than me, or at least he was ahead of me in school. Um, but so it's funny, I don't think you necessarily like rivalries sort of develop without anybody's design. They just sort of happen. And
Right.
so, Steve and I mean, obviously, tall guy, short guy. A guy who's kind of a fluid, graceful player, a guy who's more of a fire hydrant, flying through the air. Like we were opposites in so many ways, but we were both kind of natural leaders for our teams. And so we just ended up in, because of the way the game was played, it was totally pre-observer in terms of our early years. Like if there was an argument on the field, like we were probably arguing you know, because, the two players involved would scream about the call and then the captains would step in and scream at each other about the call. So, we sort of ended up kind of oppositional roles fairly often just because it's how the game was played. And then the fact that we had those differences. And then there's, fundamentally, I never really cared what people thought about me. And I think Steve really always cared. Like he wanted to be seen as a really positive role and a positive kind of influence on the game. And I wanted to win, and I didn't really care if people thought I was a positive person or not. And so a lot of sort of the way Steve approached things was this sort of like, oh come on, like think about seeing it this way. And I would just like like no, like it's just, and I'm not saying that proudly. It's just sort of like that was not something I cared about. I cared about the game and fairness within the game, but not this broader sense of let's do what's best for the sport because that wasn't what I was thinking about. And so I think fundamentally we like at our core, my goal was to be great and to win. And fundamentally at Steve's core, it was to be a part of a community and to participate in that community in a competitive endeavor. And either one of those focuses can be one you agree with and one you believe in, and they're both valid in the end. But they weren't the same. And so that I think is a lot of where Steve and I didn't connect, is that our fundamental core principles were not necessarily aligned. Now, that's not to say that I don't want to see the game grow. I don't support the greater growth of the game. I do, but I just didn't feel like that was my role. My role was lead my team to greatness and victory. So,
Mhm.
you know, I and generally we were respectful of each other, but there was this one moment in 93 where we did get into a physical altercation that was regrettable for both of us ultimately. And, I think that probably boiled over largely because they were sick of losing to us. And the funny thing is, though it's not as talked about, like I went through that. We used to lose to Boston in the Kaboom days by 2 goals every game. And to give you an idea of
Mhm.
how much of a student of the game my mother was, she didn't just feed us, like she watched the games. And we're driving home from a tournament in Purchase, driving back to New York. And there I am saying, oh, we almost had Boston this time. I thought we were going to beat them this time, just lost. If only one play had gone another way. And she's just driving there. She's like, nope, nope. What do you mean? She's like, they're better than you. You're not going to beat them. They're better than you. You can imagine, right? This is my mom.
Yeah,
Come
Mama
on.
Dobyns,
Like,
just the truth, the
but
truth.
it was the truth. Like we were not going to beat them. And she was right. And so we had to get better if we were ever going to beat them. Whereas I don't know what Boston was saying. Were they saying they had to get better, or were they saying that, they had to beat us at our game? Because there was one point when Joey Giampino from Windy City moved to Boston, and he kind of gave them this, you got to fight back against New York. That's the only way you're going to beat them. And so I think in 93, they kind of tried to beat us at our game, and that wasn't a game that they was really natural for them to play. And certainly not the kind of game that it was natural for Steve to lead. So I don't, why they broke through in the end. I mean, ultimately we quit, but at some point, I guess they started believing in themselves differently. I'm not really sure. You'd have to talk to them. But I mean, they merged with Atomizer in 92, I guess. And we still beat them in 92 again in 93. So it wasn't the merger. It wasn't them trying to play our game. Maybe it was time. I don't know.
When you say fight back, what do you mean by that? Like they started to fight back in a way that wasn't kind of natural to them. What did that actually look like on the field?
So 93, we played them at regionals and they beat us badly, but I wasn't playing. I had real bad plantar fasciitis. And so I kind of knew, it wasn't not that it's not fair, but obviously I have a significant impact on the game. So I knew we lost by 7.
Wow.
So it was, if it was going to happen, probably was going to happen that year. But when we met them in the semis, then at nationals, that was the next time we played them. Um, it was early in the game, and we'd just scored, gotten a break, and gone up 3-1. And we were just, we knew that one way that, I mean, if you know a team doesn't necessarily believe they can beat you, then every goal you score, you want to scream and yell, right? You want to get that idea in their heads that, yeah, it's happening. Here it comes. It's going to happen again. And so I'm like, yeah, and I happened to just walk by Steve, and he basically hit me in the back of the head with his elbow, like deliberately swung his elbow and hit me. And, and I was astonished. I mean, that's not Steve. And I grabbed him and spun him around like, what the are you doing? And all Jeremy Seager just saw me spin him around, and he came flying in and knocked me with both of his hands. But just because I'm so much shorter than he is, he ended up punching me in the face. Not meaning to. He was just trying to knock me, but I'm small.
Yeah.
So I came up, my lip bleeding. I mean, people went like it was a brawl. It was a full scale physical altercation in the middle of semis. Um, and it,
Unheard of at an ultimate tournament, that's for sure.
yeah, and unheard of from Boston. Like they might say, "Oh yeah, those New York guys, right?" But, um, but before we could go on with the game, I wanted Steve because Jeremy didn't know what had happened, and I know like Jeremy would never have done that. That's not Jeremy. Like he wouldn't come knock me over like that. But he thought I was starting a fight with Steve, and I wasn't. I was reacting to Steve hitting me, and I said, "Steve, you tell him the truth. Like tell him you hit me. That's why I did that," and he did. Now, subsequently, he denies that he hit me first. Like his memory, memory's a construct. So now he's constructing it differently. But in that moment, he did admit that he hit me first. But that cratered them because it wasn't who they were.
Right.
And it just we beat them by 7. Like, it wasn't close. And they were a much better, I mean, at that time they were probably a better team than us,
Yeah.
certainly equal to us. But that sort of, that's not the game they were going to play. They weren't going to beat the bully by fighting back. They were just going to be better. You know, that's what they needed to do. And so that was an unfortunate incident. And who's to say, maybe some of that was what I, kind of fed into this sense that that was such a disappointing experience and I didn't want to live it again, because that was not pleasant. There was another fight in the second half between Joey and Cribber. Like, it was just a bad game.
Uh-huh.
Um, and I think, and you'd have to talk to them and see if they were talking about it in their private meetings. But I do think there was a sense that we've got to stand up to New York or we're never going to beat them. And I don't think that was the right way for them to approach it. I just, um, but I don't know what they were saying to each other. Um, but yeah, Steve and I have
So
never talked about it since then. I was actually thinking when I was watching the interview, one of these days I should get together with Steve just to hash it out.
that'd be great to record and see what you guys all talk about. That'd be like a flash from the blast from the past, the two rivals and different styles and whatnot. Yeah.
Yeah, and, so and Bill Rodriguez and I are very close. Like, Bill is I mean, he's I have intense respect for him. He's an incredibly intelligent guy, and I really love playing with him. And he used to tell me years later, like, you would really get along with Steve. He's just like you. He's smart. He's funny. Like, you're both really quick. I think you guys would really get along. And I'm just like, no way. Like, that's not possible. But at the same time,
I
I trust Bill's judgment,
I
and I
I
wouldn't be surprised.
I think like, you know, the I'm just thinking of the NBA as you're talking, right? Like the Bulls of the 90s, like Jordan, they all, Magic, or like they all, well, they weren't 90s, but like they all kind of hated each other back then in the NBA, right?
Yeah,
And now like all the NBA players are like friends and they'll, Instagram, Twitter friends, whatever.
right.
But I think that's just the the internet media has connected everybody in a way that's never been the case. Whereas before, it's like, oh yeah, the Boston guys, the LA guys, the Dallas, Chicago, whatever, New York,
Right.
like it was just different. But nowadays, they're all kind of friends with each other. So it seems like it's just a difference with the time of the culture, the
Yeah,
timing of the culture.
and look, I also think, one of the things that changed that a lot also was, when the Olympics allowed professional players, all of a sudden there was this opportunity for them to play together every 4 years, which prior to that, like, it didn't happen. And you didn't see great players go from one franchise to another or the hated rival, right? It just didn't happen as much. So some of it, yeah, was this kind of isolation that bred this kind of tribal mentality, right? Where you're just like,
Mhm.
yeah, that's the enemy. I could never, you know, a lot of that's gone. Um, and maybe for the better. Although I tell you, some of those great, like, Detroit Pistons, um, Chicago Bulls games where, just, it was intense. Celtics, like, I mean, they did not like each other. And there's something to say. There's something to say for that type of theater where
Yeah.
where you feel like they really have a vested interest in wanting, other than the outcome of the game, like, just to beat that person, to beat that team. You don't see a lot of that anymore. Maybe for the better, I don't know. But that it was pretty
Yeah.
exciting to watch.
So I'm gonna reread the quote from the Hall of Fame because I want to talk about spirit of the game and get your take. So while the ferocity of Dobyns' competitive spirit has prompted some to question his commitment to the spirit of the game, he earned the respect of those who played against him at the highest levels of competition by playing hard, fair, and with tremendous heart. So I want to get your take on this sentence because in some ways those two things don't necessarily jive. Question commitment to spirit of the game, but then also it says that you play hard and fair. So part of how I would see spirit is, and a big part of what I would say is fair play. That's it literally in the definition of spirit of the game, having integrity. So why were there people that, maybe you're speculating, but why would people say they're questioning your commitment to it, but then also saying you earn the respect of those who played against you by playing fair, right? Like something, something doesn't jive there.
Okay. Yeah, yeah, and it's a good point. And I think, your parsing of the sentence uh is valid. Um, First of all, I should point out that I wrote the sentence. Um, and so, that I remember there was some kind of, Facebook or RSD thread at some point, that,
Ooh,
somebody.
RSD. I haven't heard of that in a long time.
Yeah, it was where you wanted to be back in the day. Um, but somebody basically saying, that, yeah, because, look at Dobyns, as even his Hall of Fame write up mentions that he's not spirited. And I was like, yeah, I wrote it, guy. Like, you know, just listen. And because to me, there's no way not to acknowledge it, right? Um, First of all, like, it took probably 3 years from when I was eligible for me to get in, and I know what some of the conversations were about. Precisely that, right? So to not mention it to me would be foolish. Um, but the one of the challenges of spirit is that, and it's just the nature of interpretation. The way it's written, I mean, it's great. Like, you can't deny that it's nice stuff, but to take that writing, and then you've got, on any given day, 14 individual players playing with their interpretation of that statement. And so, is it spirit? A big thing in our day, pre observer, was respect my call. And if you don't respect my call, it's unspirited. But if somebody makes a call that you absolutely think is terrible, why is it spirited just to say, oh, well, okay. Like, why not say, no, that's not a foul, or no, like, and so questioning people's calls was unspirited. Now, if you look at it, questioning somebody's call isn't, it's not, I mean, it has nothing to do with fair play or integrity. It's a disagreement. I disagree with that call. And then, observers come into play. And at one point, because I had time on my hands, I guess, I looked back through all the games that I have tapes of, VHS tapes of games. And at no time did I ever make a call that an observer overturned. And so I wasn't making bad calls. And when I questioned calls, they were overturned. Like, there was no instance in any of these tapes at all these high level games of making bad calls or questioning calls that were valid. And so it really, that on that level, that was a lot of it, was this idea that we didn't just respect everybody's call. And I don't think that's a clause in spirit. When I think about what was spirited play, it was playing hard. It was playing to the best of your ability. And it was, frankly, not cheating, not making bad calls, which effectively is cheating to some degree. And what New York had is this reputation that was largely born as a narrative out of people who had been eliminated from a tournament and were watching games. And half the time, you don't even know what's going on when a call's made during a game. And so the narrative was, these guys are cheaters. These guys make bad calls. And very often those calls were upheld by observers. So they couldn't have been that bad.
Sure.
And when the players who we were actually playing against, when we'd have conversations, there was none of that. Now, the biggest thing for me, and Mike O'Dowd gave me a hard time about this, but I'm a small guy. So he was an observer one time, and we had probably at Worlds in 1991 in Toronto. We had a sideline conversation about this. But because I'm a small guy, it's hard for me to get a throw off against a marker, because usually I'm getting covered by a taller guy because I was an end zone receiver. So they put somebody on me who was bigger. And so I had to learn how to break mark. And one of the ways I learned is I developed a really good hammer. Because what I could do, because my hammer was so good, is I could just cock my arm back like this, and my defender would jump in the air to block the hammer. And as soon as he gives up his feet, I would step into the space that was left open on the backhand side, and he would come down on me, and I would invite the foul and get the throw. Now, to me, that's fair. That's the way the rules are written. But it's more consistent with basketball, right? You get a guy off the ground, and then you wait for him to hit you, and then you take the shot. You definitely, I mean, it's a foul. It has to be, right? Because he's given up the ground. Well, other people felt that I was stepping into their space. And so that gray area in the rules is where I got a lot of grief from people I played against, because, no, you're stepping into me. And I said, well, you're in the air. So I get to step into that space. And if you hit me when you come down, that's on you. So things like that became this sort of narrative around, these guys are unspirited, which I don't believe was in any way unspirited. So that's why I say, at the highest levels, like, there wasn't that sense, but the people watching the game They would see from, 50 yards away, me step forward to get my backhand, get hit and take the throw and call foul. Um, they just, and if you played at a high level, you knew what I was doing. You knew the reason the guy was in the air is because I faked the hammer. And so, hey, that's on him. But if you're somebody who gets eliminated in the quarterfinals every week, you're like, hey, that sucks. So, um, you know, the spirit clause in and of itself is wonderful language, and I love that it's a part of our sport. But the fact that it gets then interpreted individually by everybody who plays naturally creates an environment where two people who love the game, who both consider themselves to be fair players, can vehemently disagree over what it means. So
Yeah.
I don't know if that answered your question.
I think it does. One of the things you talked about was if you're watching the game from far away, you have no idea what's going on. You probably I don't know if you know this, but they have hand signals now
Yeah.
that even during most of my playing career they didn't, because when you're watching it on television or from far away, you're right, you have no idea what's happening, and you're like sitting there, what's going on? Was it a foul? Was it a travel? Was it a stall? Was it? And so then you just in your mind you're kind of like, especially if you guys have won 5 in a row. Naturally, you become the bad guys, and people want to see you go down. And so nobody likes when the teams that are on top. So there's a natural inclination towards that. That okay, they're doing something different. Oh, there's Kenny again. We see him in the big game again, doing his little thing. When uh, that's kind of a narrative that's being driven that is not necessarily true, right?
Yeah,
So
yes. Mooney made a comment on camera during the finals in '91 where Andy Bornstein was doing the color, and he said, Steve, it sounds like the crowd's really behind you today. And he's like, yeah, I'm not sure if they want us to win or they want New York to lose, but I'll take it. And so that's like kind of recognizing that that was the case. Like everybody was tired of seeing us win. You'd win two, you win three. Oh, great. Nobody wants to see you win four and five. Like they're done with it.
right.
Like, next guy.
Well, I think the spirit question is sometimes interpreted as, hey, be super nice at all times. And while that is a good thing, that doesn't necessarily go against spirit of the game if you are like being how do you find the balance between being super passionate and drive to win, but it's that that's I think interpreted as win at all costs sometimes. And you made the point of, well, that doesn't mean you're cheating, that doesn't mean you are making like consistent bad calls to try to turn the tides, the game into your favor by making poor calls, right? That's just simply, hey, I have a desire to win. I've put in the work, I've put in the time, and okay, I may not have been the nicest in that interaction, but I'm still trying to play fair. But yeah, maybe I could be more docile. But it that's part of the challenge of when you're running at 1,000 miles an hour. You are very tired to like compose you're out of breath,
No,
and
100%.
when somebody makes what you
Right.
perceive as a bad call, to just all of a sudden be like, oh, oh, I appreciate that. Thank you for your, call, and, kind of go through this interaction. Like, yeah, to your point, there's going to be a lot of different interactions, but generally the people that are more fiery, right, like you, it, it, it can come off as like you are making poor calls, which, by the way, I talked to Curto about it, and he's like, Kenny, I respected the heck out of New York, and he was fiery and hot headed and all those things, but I never once felt that he was cheating, New York was cheating, or they took advantage of us. It was they respected you because it was fair, and they admired the way that you guys played. He never felt once that it was against spirit of the game or anything like that. So I thought you should know that.
Well, I appreciate that. And I do think that, there's part of it of also was, there's a level of kind of the mental warfare, and maybe warfare is a bad choice, but the mental battle where, I always believe that if I could get the opponent worried more about me than the game, that's a win for us. And
Yeah.
and so we would I mean, and some of it was, tongue in cheek, you know, um, the flip, we flip the disc, you know, and so we would call up, which doesn't really mean anything. And then no matter how the disc landed, we'd all cheer. Like that's what we meant, and sometimes you get away with it, sometimes you don't, but it was just sort of part of this game that we like to play, the game within the game, you know? Yeah, because again, like, and we were playing, God, who was it? It was the finals in 90. Maybe it was Iguana, but they got upset about our shirt because we had a shirt that was black on the front with a big white stripe and then black on the back. And they wanted to wear their shirts that were black and white stripes. And they're like, okay, go ahead and wear them. I was like, no, but you're in black and white stripes. And I was like, yeah, well, these are our darks. And it's like, okay, well, that's not dark. It's got white in it. I was like, okay, well, there are lights. Like, basically, we were gonna wear that shirt. And if it got them that upset before the game even started, what are they thinking about? Who cares what shirt you're in? You're about to play the national finals. Like, think about something other than your shirts. But the longer we could keep that conversation going, the more out of the game they were. And to me, that's like, those are things that, to me, it's natural. It's part of competition. If I can get somebody thinking about something that's not specific to the game, I'm going to do it every time. And if part of the way I do that is by not being a nice guy, but not cheating, just not being a nice guy about it, I have no problem with that. And if that's my greatest kind of crime, I can live with that.
That's good. You were a guy that talk about just your life of playing Ultimate. Sounds like when you were playing Ultimate, you were doing it at like 1,000 miles an hour, like you talked about. You were all in, you were, leading the team, you were training at a high level, like you were completely dedicated. How did that affect your personal life? You kind of talked about like you got married later in life because you were kind of focused very strictly on Ultimate. Talk about your mentality of the sport, your dedication to it, and then what happened afterwards. Like,
Yeah.
what was that transition like? Because I think that's hard. I mean, I recently kind of retired, I guess, not formally, but it's and I did it for a long time too. Longer than you. The longevity is different, I think, nowadays because training and all that stuff. But it's not easy because you get used to that, and it just kind of becomes like a high. Like you just I love competition, right?
Right.
I love playing in high pressure moments. You're either the goat or the goat kind of thing. Like that's invigorating to me.
Yeah, and it's hard to find something else to fill that in, right?
Mhm.
I'm still extremely competitive. We played the game of life with the kids the other night, and I was like, and I won, and I'm like, yep, daddy wins again, like to my 9-year-old, right? In the game of life, right? It's you don't ever really give it up, and yeah, you can't find that anywhere else. Nor the camaraderie that the closeness that you get from the grind of the practices, and yeah, there's no substitute for it. But from the standpoint of kind of the way I approached it, I mean, I remember early on, um, God, I was living on the Upper West Side and started dating this girl, and we had a tournament. And she couldn't believe that I was going to go away for the whole weekend to a tournament. And she's like, you'd rather go play a frisbee tournament than be with me? And just because I'm stupid and couldn't leave well enough alone, I said, actually, I'd rather go to a frisbee practice than be with you. So,
Oh
like,
gosh.
no need, absolutely no need. But of course, that was the end of that relationship. So but that's sort of a picture of it. There was one girl who I was really in love with, and I thought I might end up marrying, and this was right at the start of kind of us, being who we were going to become. And they did that Amazing Games piece on ESPN. This is back in 89, 90. And, in it, I talk about how I'm totally committed to Ultimate and it's more important than God, family, job, any of those things. And I was actually stupid enough to say to her, like, yeah, you should watch it with your family, and I knew her family, like, and sure enough, she watched it. And I basically said, you'll never be as important as Frisbee. And she broke up with me a little later. And I was surprised, like why, like it's just like that's and I will say this, as much as the run was great and I was totally committed to it and I wouldn't change anything, I do look back and I'm a little bit like, you know the we were so over the top, but I personally was so over the top in terms of my commitment. Could I have been as good a player and maybe a better person to the people outside the game? Probably. But I didn't have the maturity to see that then, you know? And so to my, when I think about why it's great that I'm a father now and wasn't a father then, is my whole worldview was so skewed to in terms of what I thought was important and how important I thought my commitment to the game was. I think I would have been a lousy father,
Yeah.
lousy husband, I'm not that now. And so that, it's probably worked to my benefit as well as my kids' benefit that I didn't become a father until after the game
Yeah.
was gone from my life because, yeah, it was for me an all consuming endeavor. Now, I watch guys on my team make it work, get married, have kids, and, be great family men, but none of them were in my role. And so I don't know that the role that I chose to play is a role that was compatible with other passions. Um, I remember I was studying creative writing with a playwright, a guy by the name of A.R. Gurney Jr. And I only learned later because a friend of mine in Ultimate, a guy named Pete McCabe, actually dated this guy's daughter. Um, that he, for years, said that I was one of the most promising students he'd ever had. But at the time, he said to me, he's like, listen, it's obvious your passion is ultimate, and a person can't have two passions. So when you aren't passionate about ultimate anymore, maybe then you should try to write. But you're just there isn't enough room in your life for it. And to me, that was kind of a microcosm of really all things in the sense that there was not enough room in my life for all those other things that would have required a passionate commitment because there just was only so much passion I could have. So when the time came and I stepped away, I was so ready that I really never noticed the gap. I just did other things. Eventually, I moved down to North Carolina to spend time with my family, more time with my family. I blew off a lot of family events over the years for Ultimate, you know, um, and I was able to really mend some fences with people who I needed to. And so when the time came for me to step away, I was so ready for it that I really never felt it as like there's a void here, like that. It was just done. I mean, I guess I'm lucky because I'd say the other side to that is part of the reason I was able to step away was because I had put so much into it, and I really felt like, okay, that was I deposited a lot of money in that bank, a lot of personal capital, and now
Yeah.
I'm ready to do something else. So I don't know how it worked for you or for others, but that's sort of how it worked for me.
I'm still figuring that out right now, but I
Okay.
can tell you what, I'm married now and then I have a kid and one on the way. That's probably the easiest way to get me away. I mean, I love Ultimate, don't get me wrong, but I love being a dad, a husband, like it's the best. So for me, it kind of seems like the timing was perfect. So I got another quote here, and I know you probably need to kind of go soon, but I want to, if you don't mind, I just want to bring up a quote from this article that I read, which I guess has to do with your brother a little bit. But it says, as Dobyns' coaching career began, your brother, with North Carolina State from 96 to 2001, State stood apart from ECU and UNC Wilmington in not adapting the style that was imported to Eastern North Carolina from Brian's brother's New York team. Noted Ultimate historian Tony Leonardo related that Dobyns was a driving factor in this adherence to playing the game differently. What do you think he meant by that? And obviously, the irony is that this is your brother saying the game was played differently, but what do you think he was kind of talking about there?
I don't know. I will say this, for anybody, I wouldn't want to kind of try to guess at what they were saying, but I certainly will say this. I mean, Brian and I over the years had a lot of conversations, and we were different people and we approached the game differently. Um, and I those were some great times. So that was when Brian started coaching at NC State was when I had moved down to North Carolina. And some of the greatest times I had with Brian were watching him coach, going to tournaments that he was coaching.
Mm.
I was at the nationals that NC State won, where they knocked off Santa Barbara in a complete upset that no one expected, and that was like the tremendous pride right? And seeing my brother kind of achieve that goal. But we were very different people, and we always conscious of our differences, but also always keenly aware of our closeness. And so we managed to make it work. But yeah, did he disagree with our approach? Yeah, he did. I mean, so he played with Kaboom when we went to nationals in '83, and that was the last time we played on the same team. And we got into a really ugly game with the Sky Pilots, which I mentioned before. And it got very, I mean, truly ugly, to the point where Brian quit. Like he said, I'm not playing. This is not ultimate. I'm not going to play this game. And he went to the sidelines. And I mean, he was a great player, one of our best throwers on our team. He would pull, you know, best deep throwers we had. And and he quit. He went to the sidelines and didn't come back in the game. And that was a rift for the two of us because I really felt like he quit on us. And it took me a long time to realize that he couldn't play that game. Like to him, it really was not the game that he wanted to play because it was so ugly and mean spirited and just competitive at the cost of respect um, among the players. So in that initial moment, I was like, "You quit on us," and then in the end, I learned that okay, he didn't quit on us. Effectively, the game quit on him because of the game we turned it into. He couldn't play that, and so that
It had crossed the line, you said. It
right,
had crossed the line of disrespecting the
right,
people, right?
and I'll
Okay, yeah.
freely admit, I those guys, I don't. If I saw them today, I wouldn't speak to them with any bit of respect. It truly crossed the line. Some things were said that should never be said in Ultimate or anywhere. Um, so Brian's approach and what made him a great coach is that nothing that he wanted to do was ever bigger than his players, and his focus was how do I give my players the tools to be successful, and then I step away and let them be successful. And he never made it about him. He wasn't one of those coaches
Mhm.
who's out there on the field between every point. Like that's not how he coached. He taught them, he coached them, he groomed them, he gave them the skills, and then he said, "You guys go play the game." And he would make suggestions, of course, about strategy and things like that, but always from the sideline. He very rarely would step onto the field. It's funny because one of the last games that he was coaching YCC, and I streamed the game. And between points, the other team's coach was on the field, and it probably wasn't until 10-9 that I even saw Brian because he was always on the sidelines. He was never on the field, and that's just how he was. So you can imagine. I mean, I'm a guy who basically I was happy to have the game be about me, and he's a guy who always wanted it to be about the game. And so, yeah, we were not aligned in that way. So whether it's because UNCW and ECU modeled themselves after us or not, Brian was a very different person, and frankly, a better person.
Yeah, he seemed to have a really big impact in the coaching community in the Carolinas
Yep.
through a lot of different teams, boys, girls, YCC, college, kind of everything.
Yeah.
So,
It was really
yeah.
actually cool to hear from a lot of those people after he passed. Um, he touched a lot of people.
What are you doing now? Are you involved in the sport at all now? And if so, what? No.
Not at all. The level of my involvement is watching my nephew. So Brian's two sons both play at UVM, Ryan and Tim. They're both named Bliss rather than Dobyns because he and his wife flipped the coin, and the winner the kids would take their last name.
Are these Brian's
They're
kids?
Brian's kids, but they're Tim Bliss
Okay.
and Ryan Bliss, and
Okay.
so he got to name them, but they took her last name because of the coin flip. Um,
Coin flip.
yeah, my brother, he had his quirks.
He should have yelled up. He should have
Yeah,
yelled up like
exactly,
you guys, right? Up.
exactly. Um, but yeah, that's the extent of it. I mean, I've watched some streams. I've gone to a couple of regional tournaments, but no, I mean, the last time, gosh, I don't even remember. When was the last time I was at national? I guess when my induction into the Hall of Fame, and so that probably would have been 12 years ago. I went to nationals, but yeah, I don't follow at all. Um, yeah, I don't know who anybody is. I went to one professional game. I guess when it was MLU, I don't even know if it's still MLU.
It's called the U. Well, there was the AUDL, MLU, and now MLU is defunct, and now it's the UFA,
Okay.
Ultimate Frisbee Association.
Yeah, and believe me, I've there are times when I've thought, yeah, I'd love to go to a game, and I even made plans to go to a game, but then life gets in the way, and it's really easy for me not to do that because for so many years it was the number one priority. So I generally, I mean, go see my kids' baseball practice, take my daughter to gymnastics, have dinner with my wife. Like any of those things is more important than ultimate. So
Yep.
it's easy for me to be away from it. Um, but yeah, I can't speak intelligently to the sport at all, so I'm not going to try. And then when Brian was still alive, I went to some of his tournaments. The high school team he was coaching down in North Carolina, and so I saw some high school ultimate down there as well.
Well, if you still have the same personality where when you're doing something you're all in, it makes sense that, hey, I'm a father, husband,
Right.
like, so I'm all in on that. So when you say yes to things in a big way, you say no to a lot of other things,
Right.
right? So it makes perfect sense. So the Hall of Fame, I wanted to ask you about that, but so I was looking at the time of your induction. You talked about it earlier, like it took you 3 years to get in. I'm not an expert on how one gets in, but it seems like, and maybe the early, kind of the first couple years were a little different, but I think like as a male, you have to be 42 years old or something like that. But which you obviously were when you were inducted, but like I saw Mooney was inducted in 2006 and you weren't inducted until 2011. Why is the gap, do you think? Like, I don't know how that works, but it seems odd to
Yeah.
me
Okay.
as an
So
outsider.
yeah. So I mean, I can try, but I can't be sure, right? But certainly one of the things that in terms of Steve is that he was very much, I would say, a part of the establishment, right? He was very kind of uh, he had a reputation as being the guy, the spirited guy, the fair guy, the nice guy, all those things that come with that. And I don't say that with any bit of denigration. I mean, I Steve is honestly who he is, and good for him. Um, for me, the process, and I only understand it from having been through it. And I don't know about the ages, but what ends up happening is there's a slate of candidates, and when those people are in that kind of consideration phase, they put out a call to the community, and anybody in Ultimate can respond anonymously, or they can attach their name to it and say what they want. And then all that information gets disseminated to the voters. And then there's a conference call that all the members of the hall get on to talk about the candidates. And there are, people share stories, they share their perspective, they talk back and forth about what, the the kind of the skills a person might have, or maybe reasons they might not get in. And one thing that carries a lot of weight is when teammates talk about former teammates. And I didn't learn this until much later. But there was a teammate of mine who, for those years, was presenting a perspective that suggested that I did not belong. And it was only when that teammate changed his mind that my candidacy was successful. And I would prefer just to leave it like that. Um, but in the end, I think I've been a part of a lot of those conversations, and ultimate is unlike other sports that have halls of fame, where the people who vote are writers who don't have any kind of vested interest in who gets in, who doesn't. I mean, they may have biases, as we all do, but it's not like a, a former competitor having to kind of vote for somebody who they competed against. Um, I, I don't think it's a great system because it's hard to give up a lot of those memories, right? Um, and it would be, and we're probably getting to the point now where the sport's big enough and there are enough people who talk about it. I mean, if I've listened to those guys on the live streams, they know what they're talking about. They know who the great players are. They they know about their skills, their strengths and their weaknesses. It might be a time to start thinking in terms of how do we let some less partial people be a part of that conversation? Because I do think it's hard just as you said, you alluded to the fact that if you're a really intense competitor and really fiery emotionally, that in that immediate moment when a call is made, how do you suddenly step outside yourself and become,
Right.
you know, dispassionate? It can't be done.
Yeah.
And even though you're no longer in the game, I still believe that can be a hard thing for a person, even past their prime, even no longer playing, to kind of say, yeah, okay, let me look at this guy completely objectively and determine whether or not he belongs, or am I remembering the guy who I competed against all those years and couldn't stand it? So,
Yeah. I didn't know that about the process. I could see how that could be biased on a negative side, but also on the positive side,
right,
right? Like if you're somebody's teammate and they were a really nice guy and and I'm not suggesting anybody got on from that this way, but I'm just saying there can be biases that you don't even know that, you're like, oh yeah, he was a great player. Like, but when we play on each other's team, we all think, we all have kind of a bias towards our own guy, right?
right,
Or gal, right?
and
Like it's,
yeah, and that's why when a former teammate speaks negatively of you, it carries tremendous weight. Whereas you're right, it
yeah,
doesn't carry as much weight. You have a tendency to kind of not listen as much when they're promoting their teammate, because of course they're going to promote their teammate. But
yeah,
for all the more reason, when somebody says no to a former teammate, it carries a lot of weight, and that's why
yeah.
that carried the weight that it did. So, and again, because I wasn't in those conversations, I a lot of this is speculation, but again, based on conversations I've had with people subsequently, it seems like it was a pretty strong factor in those years of me not getting in. And look, I'm fine with it. I don't have any bad relationships with my former teammates. I don't blame anybody. At the end of the day, if you're approaching the process honestly and trying to do the best that you can, that's good enough. I don't have to agree with you, as long as I feel like you've thought about it. So,
So, final question, just to kind of wrap things up. First, thank you so much for your time. This has been outstanding. It's been a pleasure getting to know you. As you think of like younger Ultimate players right now, do you have like one lesson you've learned over the years that you think is really would be great for young people to know, whether that's on the field, off the field, that you would kind of say to a younger, budding, aspiring Ultimate player that wants to be the best? What would you say? What would you say to them?
yeah. I actually would not, in terms of ultimate, probably say much of anything, but I would say something and I was a school teacher for 5 years, down in North Carolina, and to me, the teacher component is a part of my life all the time. Although I stopped teaching, I'm still a teacher. And so one of the things I used to always talk to my kids about is kind of understanding knowledge. And because knowledge ultimately pervades everything you do, having an understanding of it, having knowledge is important. And so for me, there's basically two critical kinds of knowledge. And the first is know yourself. And so for a young player, it's like really look at yourself, look at your skill set, look at how you approach the game, look at your preparation, look at your execution, like and with really unvarnished eyes, see what you are. And in seeing what you are, see what you're not, because those are the things you need to focus on. And there's a natural tendency as competitors to do the things we do well and do them again and again and again. But
Mm,
what we really need to do is do the things we do poorly and make those better, right? And so that
mm,
self knowledge, really looking at yourself and saying, okay, where are my strengths, where are my weaknesses, where are the things I really need to work on to make myself a more complete player. And then the other piece of knowledge you have to have is to know that no matter how much you don't know anything. Like there's so much to learn. And so never stop learning. I don't know that I've ever told Steve Mooney this, but one of the things I brought to myself as a player, I took from him. And he had this tendency on his forehand side to fake, not actually by faking, but just to kind of swipe the disc down. And what it did is it looks like a throw, but it's really not. And the disc is in a really good position in terms of being held to come to the backhand. Whereas if you fake a throw, the disc is kind of coming out of your hand and you've kind of got to re-grip it to bring it around. And so
mhm,
the willingness to take something from a guy who you are competing against and want to beat, like that's the kind of knowledge that you need to be on the lookout for all the time. Where do I pick up the next thing that's going to make my game better? We didn't have coaches. So the best players and the ones who got better year after year were the ones who looked at their game, saw their weaknesses, and worked on those in order to get better. But you had to have the motivation to do that. It may be
Uh,
different now that there's so much coaching. You may sit down with a coach at the end of the year and get all these pointers about what you have to work on. I don't know. You've got stats out, the yin yang. I mean, it's probably a very different game. But ultimately, for me, it was about knowledge. It was about self knowledge and this insatiable curiosity to continue to learn and get better. And if you can do those two things, you're generally going to be successful at whatever you do.
Awesome. That's great. Super great advice. Well, Kenny, thank you so much. This has
Thank
been
you.
outstanding.
No, this has been great for me. I'm thanking you. I haven't thought about a lot of this
No,
stuff for years, so it's fun to talk about.
yeah, no, I hope people find your wisdom and knowledge and just experience within the sport helpful and resourceful for them to help them grow and learn. And are there any, like, what's the best video to watch of you? Because there's not much video from the 80s and 90s, but is there like something we can go to be like, hey, that's the best Kenny Dobyns highlights that there is?
I don't think so. I mean, I got a call recently. I although I have a Facebook account, like I haven't been on Facebook because I just don't have the time. I found myself scrolling through it one day and I was like, this is the hugest waste of time in my life. And so I just deleted it from my phone. And so Cribber called me and he's like, hey, did you see that thing I put up? And I was like, no, I have no idea what you're talking about. And he had done a little clip of highlights of me to put out there, which I thought was very gracious of him, and it was fun to see that. That's the only thing that I know of that exists in terms of highlights. Um, and he posted it to the Ultimate Frisbee Hall of Fame account, and I guess he also posted it to his Flatball Films account. So that's out there if you want to go looking for it.
I'll have to
What
check
was
that out.
Yeah.
I'll try to find that and put that in the comments
Okay.
of this video.
Well, and I'll tell you what was fun about it was then the series of comments and replies to comments that people do on Facebook. It was fun, and I did read them all, and again, some of them complimentary, some of them less so. To your point about spirit, there was one guy who said, "Oh, he spiked the disc. That's not spirited," you know. And like that's another one of those things that just like nobody who plays at a high level cares if you spike the disc. But people who
Everybody
never
does that at the high level now.
Right, exactly.
Everybody does it.
Right.
It's
But the
like too
people who,
much,
yeah,
actually.
but the people who never got there, that was a huge thing, particularly when it just started. Like, oh, you're unspirited because you spiked. It's just another way that the perspectives aren't always the same about this communally held belief. And so yeah, that was one where it's just like, okay, whatever.
Yeah, that's so funny. Sorry, one last one, but we didn't talk about this. The greatest and the stupidest.
Okay.
How did that come about? So were you the first person to do the greatest?
Let's just put it this way. I am the first person that I know of to do it in tournament competition. Now, people have said, oh yeah, we were doing that for years, and that may be true. Um, but yeah, when we went out it was in Santa Cruz at the World Flying Disc Championships in 1984.
Mhm.
And we were playing against Flying Circus from San Francisco. And Mike Nevins threw a forehand pass to the corner of the end zone. And it was just clear to me as soon as he threw it that it was just out of bounds. It was an errant pass. And we never practiced like it. Now I know a lot of times people practice the greatest. Like, can they, go to the sidelines and jump and grab it and throw it again? We never did. Um, but what happened in that particular instance, which was so amazing because we had never done it before. I don't know that it had been done before, certainly not in a game, but our ability as athletes to process information incredibly quickly and from multiple sources is something we don't think about a lot because it's second nature, but it's really amazing because it happens in microseconds. And so as I was running to the corner, looking at the pass, realized I was going to have to jump and throw it back in, there was a voice behind me, and it was Pat King saying, throw it back in, Ken. And we'd never done it before. Like, why is he thinking about it? And I'm thinking about it, and we'd never experienced this. And in addition, as I was about to take off and looking at the pass, knowing it was a forehand with the counter spin, was that because I was reaching for it with my right hand, I was going to have to bring my elbow in to get my thumb in a position to catch it because the spin was going to kick it away from my hand if I didn't. And so you've got all these things going on,
Mhm.
and it's literally in microseconds. And so I caught it thumb up and flipped it back over my shoulder, and I couldn't see because I was racing out of bounds. I flipped it to the sound of Pat's voice only because he said something, and he literally caught it, like pancaked it right in front of him. So, the fact that all those factors came together in one moment was, it kind of blew our minds. And so we started telling the story, and we just called it the greatest play in the history of the game, just because that's what we wanted to call it, because we were self-aggrandizing storytellers who, loved the kind of the overblown kind of hyperbolic
The New
retelling of it.
York way to tell a
Yeah,
story, right?
there you
Yeah.
go. So that's how and then it just mercifully got shortened to the greatest. But I mean, to my knowledge, it was the first time so that was '84, and the funny thing is they actually wrote about it in the UPA newsletter. Um, but they called me Kenny Robbins because whoever wrote it didn't know. So
Uh,
that was that. So all these little pieces that come from that. But yeah, that was the origin of the greatest. And then so yeah, it was 5 years later that there were two of them in the national final in DC. Um, I threw one to Pat that he caught and threw back to Cream, and then Rick Geyer had one for Tsunami. So in one game in finals there was actually two greatest. I don't know how often it happens, how many of them there are now, but back then it was pretty cool.
wow, that's incredible. That's so good. So, okay, then what's the stupidest? Where did
Uh,
that come from?
the stupidest, actually, I didn't do it. It was actually, I think it was Crib. It might have been Walter, but I called it the stupidest. But basically, it's where a guy would have been in bounds, but instead jumps in the air and grabs it and throws it and turns it over. And it's just because they weren't
Trying to
sure,
do the greatest,
right?
like, but they could have just towed it
They could have
in.
just
Yeah.
towed it in, and so that's the stupidest.
Oh, that's good. That's so good. All right, I think people enjoy hearing that. Awesome. All right, well, thank you, Kenny. This has been amazing. I know you got to go, but thank you so much for your time.